right, so let's look at the timeline for the major architectural styles that I wanted to cover inside this course. We're gonna break it down into chunks. We're not gonna focus on everything at lesson one. It's all gonna be spread out to 8 lessons. In this first lesson, we'll focus on Neolithic, Mesopotamian, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and ancient Rome. Those are the styles I'll be talking about. And then as we progress, we'll learn a little more about other styles. At the lesson 8, we'll focus on Southern Asia, which is the Indian style, Chinese architecture, Japanese architecture, and South American Mayan architecture. The reason I'm breaking it down that way is because there's a lot of information to be covered. Also, bear in mind, this is just a brief representation of the major talking points for each of the architectural style. We're not going to go really deep into the architecture itself. We're just going to cover the major points, the major style points, and what makes those specific styles so interesting. The reason to make a timeline like this and break it down, and also the reason to actually incorporate architectural styles in this course is very simple. Architecture is a foundation for environment painting, in my opinion. As much as you know about architecture will actually help you to construct more interesting and more realistic buildings, something that actually can be conveyed in more realistic way. Remember that regardless of whether you're stylizing your work, if you work for animation or illustration, or if you work in video games, which is specifically, this course is specifically about that. Once you focus on those aspects, once you focus on creating concept art for video games, it's good to know architecture for that very reason. Concept art by itself is supposed to be functional. When you create concept art for video games, it means you're creating assets that everyone else can use to actually build the game. So in order to create assets that are going to be good foundation for everyone else, such as 3D artists and designers and game designers and whatnot, you need to have a good foundation yourself as well. Otherwise, it will fall apart. So this is what this part of the lesson is going to be about. So the first architectural style I wanted to talk about briefly is Neolithic architectural style. It's actually the first recognizable architectural style in existence of humanity. The major principles about this style is basically it's very simple. The constructions were very crude and very simplistic. There are no mathematical equation that went into building those things. It's majority of construction during that era are based off stone, mud bricks, and makeshift wood, wooden logs and stuff like that. So very crude, very simplistic. It's almost the beginning of humans creating their own dwellings and towns. You can divide Neolithic era into Paleolithic caves, Paleolithic era. You can also divide it to an era where the mud brick construction started to appear. Then wattle and daub dwellings, which is those huts that you see right here, for instance. And of course, megalithic era, which is those huge megalithic stones that were created in terms of kind of temple and sacral areas. So again, the constructions themselves were very, very crude. So let's go chronologically of what was happening there. The first ever construction or the first construction and architectural stuff that was unearthed so far is Göbekli Tepe, which is right here. You can see that this is this is actually the first the oldest architectural site unearthed so far. It's clearly very interesting in terms of like how it was built. It it actually throws a wrench into the timeline of how humanity progressed with their constructions, because it's obviously slightly more advanced in terms of like how it looks when you see the round shaped base and stone placed upon stone, and even bigger constructions here. This predates Stonehenge, which we can see right here, by 6,000 years. And Stonehenge was supposed to be one of the oldest megalithic constructions. So that brings an interesting point of discussion for scientists and archaeologists. We're not obviously going to go deep into that. This course is not about archaeology or architecture itself. This is just a brief overview. But you can see in this style, you could see rocks placed upon rocks. There was no bounding material such as clay or concrete that would bind those rocks together. So those constructions had to be fairly simple. The walls would be built pretty much the very same way as one of the next bigger constructions, which is Knap of Howar, which is in the UK, I believe. So you can see this is the same sort of building style as Göbekli Tepe. It has rocks placed on top of each other. And in this situation here, it's actually almost like molding inside of a cliff. So, and this is another example. Again, rocks placed upon rocks. The roof itself, the way the roof would be constructed would be wooden logs placed very closely and being based on the walls of this construction, and then it would be mud, branches, and everything like that would be lying on top of that. In this situation, is actually smaller boulders, so there's probably a very thick layer of wood that is holding those boulders here together. And of course, that's when we're looking at this. This is around 4000 BC. Before that, we also had round houses, which were basically built from logs and wood. They would be pointy in shape, so the wood logs would be built together. This is actually a very good drawing representation of this style. So you could see that the wooden logs would intersect to create a roof, and there would be some kind of pillar that holds it together. So in those houses, you would have those pillars too. The foundation itself would be built from wood and from rocks. If it would be built from wood, you would actually have some kind of mud, clay, plaster that would be covering the wood itself and the branches itself, so there is no air coming through. It's actually would protect from cold or from extra heat. So that would be pretty much how this stuff would be built, how those houses would be built. And obviously megalithic constructions, which are dated between anywhere between 4000 and 3000 BC, which is obviously Stonehenge. It's probably the most popular one, and also the Hal Salfani. It's called hypogeum. Hard word to say. Hypogeum. It's those megalithic constructions, but carved inside a cave. So this is kind of interesting building style. Obviously, very crude and very simplistic. The way I would imagine using this style, if we would be talking about video games, because this is the next step of this conversation, how you implement this style into your work. I would imagine this could be primarily either for a history piece video game, where it would have to be accurate in terms of how those constructions are built. So in order to create accurate concepts for history piece, you would need to research even more about how those constructions are really made. Not only just looking at photos, because photos will reveal a lot about how this is this is built. But also when you actually have this diagram drawings and you actually understand, okay, this is the workspace, there's a heart of the building, you would understand how those buildings were organized for people. And this could be very helpful for the gameplay purposes, where you're not only entering the building to for a visual point of view, or the way it looks and the way things are constructed, but also from a gameplay point of view, where you could actually lay out where things are in this space, where are the tools and things that are built, where is the bonfire, and where the people are sitting. So this is pretty important to know. It actually brings that realism that I was talking about in the timeline overview. One of the reasons to actually understand this and to know this. So that's the Neolithic style. Next, we're gonna move on and talk a little bit about Sumerian Mesopotamian style. All right, this is Mesopotamian Sumerian architectural style. It's dated between 3500 BC up until roughly 2000 BC. It's considered as one of the styles that is probably one of the oldest, more serious building styles of architecture, which means the constructions are more elaborate, they're more put out, planned, and basically built. They are not based on building constructions just in the area from what is available in the area, or building it just for shelter or anything like that. This is actually more elaborate building style, and one of the oldest ones. So again, it dates between 3500 BC and 2000 BC. Mesopotamian style basically relates to area of modern Iraq. And that's as much as you need to know. It's between rivers of Tigris and Euphrates, and this is where this style developed itself. There aren't many structures that are left that represent this style. A lot of those constructions actually didn't withstand the time. It's been almost 5,000 years now since they've been built. What you see now, it's actually reconstruction. There are a lot of those three buildings we see here. Then the construction name of those buildings is ziggurats, and those are actually rebuilt. They were not looking like that 100 years ago. They were actually rebuilt and reconstructed to what these buildings would look like actually thousands and thousands of years ago. Those structures are solid. They are not hollow inside, which means inside this construction here, there is just rock. There's nothing inside. There are maybe some chambers and stuff like that, but generally, it wouldn't look like a regular castle, as you think, fortress or castle. This is not it. This is more like a sand castle construction. The walls themselves and the construction itself is based on rectangles in pretty much majority of cases, and it's pretty apparent when you look at those references. It's very rectangular. In order to add the interest and sort of like a visual style to those constructions, people that were actually building it decided to add those bevels, which are rhythmic, and also because they're hollow inside, they are not hollow inside. And there's no bounding between those rocks or those mud bricks, because those constructions are actually built from mud bricks. The wall tapering, so the wall going in an angle, actually helped to make those buildings much taller than they would be otherwise. So a very interesting way of building, making sure it doesn't collapse on itself because of the angle of the walls, because there's no bounding element for those mud bricks. What else can be said about this? This is basically what you see on the screen. Those references are from Ziggurat at Ur, and especially those two. This is another ziggurat that is in Iraq. I can't remember the name. So those constructions are pretty much the only one that are still preserved. But those were constructions built for more of rich people, to be honest. And regular constructions such as houses would be just square based, and would be very, very simple. It would be one room for a whole family. And in most cases, actually, during that era, people would build platforms and then use reeds to use it as tents around that. So houses would appear, especially when we move towards the ancient Egypt. Those houses actually appear in Egypt. But when it comes to Mesopotamian and Sumerian architectural styles, regular buildings would be just pretty much tents, very similar to what Neolithic tents would look like, or houses that are built from wooden logs, but this time just built from reeds with the mud brick platform to play upon. So that's pretty much a summary of this style. Again, one of the interesting aspects of this and the usage of this is this could be a great base for something more intricate and something more interesting. There's a lot of possibilities that it can happen by using this style. For one, I can imagine this to be in the fantasy world. This could be an amazing base for a fortress. You could actually imagine that there's some hollowness inside of it, so you could actually have some chambers and stuff like that. It would not just be this very sandcastle-like construction. It would actually be having chambers and rooms inside. A great example that has a very similar style in it is Conan. Conan movies have constructions that kind of look very similar to this. So that's really cool, and I would probably use this construction style and this architectural style in majority for fantasy worlds. Okay, towards the end of this chapter, we're actually getting into a classical era of ancient civilization and ancient architecture. And there are two parts of the classical construction era. One is Greek, and the second one is Roman. So for now, we're just going to focus on classical Greek. When you look at the classical Greek and or ancient Greek architecture, you can clearly see how different it is from how big of a step it is from ancient Egypt. It's actually a huge step. Ancient Greek and classical in general is dated between 900 and 476 BC. There's few aspects that need to be understood in terms of why this style looks like this and what was implemented and how much of a great evolution in architecture happened during that era. For one, ancient Greece is a place of philosophers and civic movements and civic development, which means because of implementation of democracy and because of how many more things people during that time could do compared to, for instance, ancient Egypt, where majority of the wealth would be inside the dynasty and everyone else would be very much poor. Here, a lot of ancient Greeks would be, the wealth distribution would be way different than during the ancient Egypt era. So one of the most important aspects is obviously civic movement, which would introduce quite interesting things into how things were built and what was built actually. So constructions themselves would not only be tombs or temples to worship gods or anything like that, they would actually have more civic duties. So for instance, libraries. Libraries are a great example of what would be an interesting architecture addition into civilization of ancient Greece. So this style, the ancient Greek style or classical Greek style, is actually divided into three different styles and three different sort of evolutions. First one is called Doric, and let's look at this diagram right here. So Doric is it's numbered as number 1 in this diagram. Doric style would be mainly used in mainland Greece and southern Italy, actually. And the three styles that I'll be talking about, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, basically is an expression of how the columns and how elaborate the constructions were. So let's look at the columns, because the columns were one of the biggest additions to ancient Greek style. One of the biggest development in architecture history, compared to the columns coming from the ancient Egypt era. So the columns in Doric would be very simple. They'll be straight, not too tall. They wouldn't have any base. The capital would be very simplistic. And the capital itself is, look at the diagram right here. You can see there's a base, there is a capital, which is that part that is holding the called architrave, which is this, this slab that is basically holding the roof itself. So the capital would be a top of a column, then the base of the column, and the column itself. When we go back here, we can clearly see that in Doris style, those would be very simple. Also, the amount of sculpting or art that would go into other elements would be very minimal. So very simplistic, moderate amount of ornaments, no base on columns. Another style would be Ionic, which was mostly used in Eastern Greece and islands, which is number 2 in this diagram. What that style would implement is that the columns would be much more thinner and more elegant, and also they would start to have the capital would be much nicer, would actually have a scroll-like look implemented to it. and also introduction of base, obviously, and more detail when it comes to the actual structure, more elaborate detail. And the third style, which is Corinthian, and the Corinthian column style is actually used in Rome as well. And this style will be way more elaborate. You can see there's much more sculpting going on here. There's a leaf motif that would be happening in the capital. There will be still a base. Those columns will also be much taller. So more development in terms of how those columns would look like. When we are talking about examples, the best example of Doric style would be the Pantheon, and you can see right here. You can see very simplistic forms, no base, very simple capital. The Ionic style, which is the second style we're talking about, would be a temple of Athena and Nike. So this would be, a great example here. You can clearly see those leaf motifs, the base, and right here it's a nice implementation of actual sculptures. And then obviously the Corinthian style, which would be the temple of Zeus, which is right here, or the remains of the temple of Zeus, which would have that leaf motif. And you can clearly see how different those styles are. Even though they are still within the same realm of architecture, you can clearly see how it progressed from here to here. There's much more details going on, way more attention to construction itself. So something to pay attention. So that will be pretty much a base overview of the architectural style of Greece, in ancient Greece or classical Greece, and it naturally moves into ancient Rome because it's pretty much connected in terms of some parts of the style. In terms of how you would use that, obviously, again, a historical piece would be a great and the most simple example to use it. But also, you could use it for fantasy. And what's important about this classical styles, which is the classical Greek and classical Roman, which we'll talk about next, is those styles actually went through revival, which we will be talking about in future lessons. And the biggest example of those revival is, for instance, the White House in United States, which has very similar aspects of the style. So in terms of how you would use it in video games, obviously, again, historical piece, but also it could be some kind of revival where you take the principles of how those constructions will build and then add your own elements to it, or maybe make the columns bigger, maybe add them as a part of a much more elaborate and larger structures and stuff like that. So there's a lot of usage. There's no specific genre that you have to limit yourself with this style. It's very timeless, and this is what makes it one of the most important architectural styles in human history, is how timeless it is. The last architectural style we'll talk about in this lesson is going to be classical Roman, or ancient Roman, if you will. This is sort of like a natural evolution of classical Greek style. There's a couple of things that were introduced that were revolutionary in terms of architecture building. And this is one of the most significant styles. And again, the second timeless style, because a lot of what you see on the screen right now, a lot of those constructions that were built during the ancient Rome times, the style of this construction pretty much prevailed till today. There's a lot of apartment complexes that are built in a very similar fashion, sort of borrowing from this architectural style. Also, the revival during the 19th century would take a lot of cues from this and ancient Greek style. So this is a very significant style in terms of how constructions were built, and there's few reasons for that. First reason is the introduction of concrete, which was very, very revolutionary because it allowed to make constructions much bigger and more elaborate. The second part is introduction of arches and how the arches were constructed. When you look at Colosseum, or when you look at an aqueduct, you can see the arches and how they're actually constructed. There is a physical explanation why it holds that way and why it doesn't collapse, but also the fact that those blocks, those bricks themselves are connected by concrete, allowed to make the constructions huge. This aqueduct is really large. You can see a human scale compared to those structures. And bear in mind, this is over 2,000 years ago. So this is a really large construction, all built from bricks. And with the introduction of concrete, it just withstand, a lot of time. So arches and bricks combined with concrete. That's two major things that happened during that era. Ancient Rome dates anywhere between 500 BC to around 400 AD. That's when the Roman Empire collapsed. So this architectural style is basically tied very closely to the Roman Empire. Few other aspects, those constructions would be again built from concrete, bricks, marble, and cut stone. Most of the construction would actually have a definite front. So, for instance, the Pantheon is a great example, which has a definite front, definite entrance, and then the rest of the building. Another interesting aspect is that you would have, because of the evolution of arches, you would also have domes. So again, Pantheon is a great example. You cannot see this on the photo here, but if you research for more photos of Pantheon, there's plenty of them available online. Take your time and research exactly how those constructions look like, the domes themselves. It's pretty interesting. But basically, the dome itself would be a natural evolution of arches, which we've discussed already. Aqueducts, that would be a new sort of addition to what would be constructed. Obviously, amphitheaters and baths. So those are like major points of what would be very new in terms of construction and in terms of like what would be built just for humans or generally for the culture. So baths are interesting because they would have, they would be what they are, what they mean. There would be baths. There was no this kind of construction built ever before, much like no aqueducts that would actually deliver water from one point to another, from one area of the country to another area of the country. That's very interesting and very technologically advanced. One of the major examples of one of the biggest examples of constructions during those eras, obviously Colosseum. It's humongous construction. It was built mainly for entertainment, to get everyone entertained, to look at fights and look at fighters and gladiators, and unfortunately it would also introduce the slavery. So that was a major aspect of why those constructions were built. Pantheon, just because of how big the dome is, and the wonder of architectural construction of the dome itself. Obviously, a Roman Forum. Right now, the parts of that forum that are still in existence are pretty much in ruins, but the forum itself would be an interesting piece of architectural wonder, just because how much space would be here, and also like the reason for the forum to be there would be also to have the buildings that are built around it would have the definite front, which we talked about, and the city layout would be much more interesting in that way too. So, and obviously finally the triumph arches. So that's where this big arches would be built in entrances to the cities, where victorious emperors would be coming back from the war and be greeted by these wonderful constructions, and then people that would greet them for their victorious comeback. So few things that we mentioned to remember, and again, this is one of the most wonderful and most recognizable architectural style. In terms of how to use it, obviously, historical piece. And again, very similar to classical Greek, where you can take cues from this existing style and build your own constructions that way. Build your own cities. You could almost use it in sci-fi if you would just replace this with different materials, but keep the style and then implement it as a larger construction. That could be some kind of interesting alien civilization or distant star civilization, for instance. So there's a lot of applications. One thing that I would urge everyone to do is spend a little more time in investigating more about those architectural styles, especially classical ones, because those are most significant ones from that era. And they've introduced a lot of technical aspects of how things are built. Again, this class is not about building constructions or building blocks and how constructing itself works. It's more about the environment design. But knowing architecture and knowing those architectural styles, and also spending extra time to investigate exactly how they were built, what time it would take to build it, and what tools it would take to build those constructions, will give you a better insight of why those things look that way, why aqueduct has those arches, and how those arches are built, and why the arch itself doesn't collapse because of the gravity, right? There's a pressure between blocks when you build an arch like this that holds this thing together, because the blocks are not just collapsing, but because of the tapering, they're actually pressing on each other, which makes this construction stand. And knowing this kind of, having this kind of knowledge, you can now understand, okay, maybe there's no need for concrete to actually hold this together. But if you add concrete, it's going to be very sturdy. So knowing those things when you design your objects, when you design your architectural pieces in your environments, is going to be very important. And it's also, it is a foundation of what the successful environment design can be, because once you start introducing buildings, you better know what the architecture of those buildings is, so you don't mix styles that just don't match each other. There's one thing about focusing on the design, but also knowing what style and how it was built and where it belongs. And once you have that knowledge, you can apply it correctly, and then whoever is going to look at your concept design will have a better understanding what they are looking at, without being confused with different styles or a lack of understanding of architectural styles. So that will be a wrap up for architectural styles for this lesson. We're going to talk about different styles in lesson 2 and 3 and so on. So let's get moving on to more interesting parts, which is tools. Let's look at Photoshop CC 2015. This is the newest updated version of the Photoshop. It looks slightly different to your regular version that you might see on your screen, unless you've updated to the latest version. It has quite a few of new options. First of all, what you will see is this new screen, and the way to disable it is in preferences. So when you click preferences, you see hide start workspace, and you can go under preferences in general, and that's going to be available right there. So let's actually start with that. Let's go to edit, preferences, general. Basically, I don't want to have that start window. I don't use it that often. I like to use the overall default window that used to be here. And you can see here, show start workspace when no documents are open. I actually gonna disable that, because what I want to do, and you'll see in a second when I press OK, I press escape, what I want to do is double click and be able to start a new file or open a file that way. And this is what I'm gonna see as soon as I open Photoshop. Okay, so quick notes about what this is. Obviously, Photoshop is not really that hard to use. It contains a toolbar, which is right here. This little bar that you see here is a toolbar, and then everything else are windows. And there are different windows. They have all their own properties, and you can actually use them depending on how and what you do for your work. So let's jump into actually customizing this workspace to what we're gonna use for lessons. In order to customize this, you can see right here in Essentials, you see the different workspaces. We're gonna create a new workspace. We wanna create the workspace that will capture keyboard shortcuts, menus, and toolbars. And let's highlight all of those and press save. So now we have a new workspace. I'm actually gonna create one more because I forgot to name the previous one, and let's call it Learn Squared Lesson 1. There we go. So from here, what I want to do is start to pretty much shut everything down. I don't like to see that many icons on my screen. I like to have it as clean as possible because a lot of those things either you're not going to use at all, or you're going to use it so sporadically, it's just overtaking your workspace that you might need for painting. So I don't need device preview. I can disable that. I don't need properties. I can disable that too. I'm not going to need paths, nor colors or swatches. The reason I'm not using colors or swatches is because swatches are limiting me to specific colors that I already sort of set for myself. There's you can actually create a custom swatches right here, and customize your work palette for your artwork. I don't like to do that because almost every work I do has a different color palette and different rules to colors, and this is kind of limiting to me, so I always disable this. Also, when it comes to color tab, let's enable it again, where you can pick colors from here. I don't use that either because it's right here on your fingertips. So just press, you can see the color picker right here is exactly same thing, exactly same functionality. We don't need that. You can actually keep it for yourself, obviously, if that's an easier way to work, where you can actually have those accessible to you right away. That's fine. I rather press it here. I know it's an extra press of a button, but it's basically I'm used to pressing those two and switching back and forth. And also, I'm doing a lot of color picking from inside the canvas that I work with, so I don't need to have my color panel or color window to be open at all times. It's actually saving me quite a lot of workspace if I close it down. I don't need libraries either, styles, or adjustments. The reason I don't need adjustments is because if you go to layer tab, you can see that if I close it here and I just create a new file, new default file, you can see that this little icon here, it's gonna highlight as add mask, but this one is create new fill or adjustment layer, and you can create pretty much any adjustment layer that you had in that adjustment tab. The last tab that I want to move is history. I don't want to disable it because I'm gonna use it, and I'm gonna move it right here and drag it, and as soon as it this